I want to talk about David a little bit this morning, but before we talk about David, I want to go back and talk about how he got to be king. But even before that, how Israel ended up with a king. There's this really interesting story in there, and I think it tells us a lot about today. You see, what happened was the people of Israel come out of Egypt, and they go through 40 years in the wilderness, and they end up in the Promised Land. And then for the 300 years from the time they end up in the Promised Land, they don't have a king. They have people called judges, and these are people that God appoints to rule over the Israel, to adjudicate disputes, to work through different stuff, to protect them from invading armies. But they don't have a king. And then what happens is in the time of Samuel the prophet, the people of Israel say, we want a king. And Samuel says, why do you want a king? Kings are going to tax you, take all your money so they can buy themselves new chariots. They're going to confiscate your good lands and then make that into their vineyards. They're going to draft your sons into the armies. They're going to take your daughters to be your bakers and your servants. Why do you want a king? And the people of Israel basically say, everybody else is a king. We want a king too. They're sounding very teenagery at this moment. And what's going on is the people of Israel are having this insecurity. They're seeing every other nation have a king. They're seeing every other nation look strong. And they're like, we don't want to do this judge thing anymore. We want a king. We want somebody to protect us, to guide us, to lead us. And so God says to Samuel, look, you've been judge. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. They're rejecting that I have a plan for them. Give them a king, and they can experience this. And when I tell you that story, and when I look at that story, it feels to me like the people of Israel are very relatable because they're in this insecure moment. They're a young nation, and they've never really been able to hold their land. They're always getting invaded by the Philistines or the Canaanites or the Midianites, or they're getting taken to the cleaners by some bad deal. They just have trouble. And so they look around and they say, well, somebody's got to do this better. Okay, everybody does it better than us. Let's do what they do. And how many of us have been in that situation where you're young and you're immature and you're trying to figure something out and you think, well, I'll just copy these other people. And so you start to dress like, or you start to copy the mannerisms of somebody you look up at. It's like you're trying on that jacket just to see how it fits, to see if it can make it work for you. And you try copying some of their speech patterns and some of their quips and their sayings just to see if you can get some of that respect or that mojo that they have. Okay, apparently I'm the only one who has ever done that. Pretty much the same thing at 8:30. Everybody at 8:30 is like, nope, never us. You guys apparently always had it all together. Okay? It's funny how when you read the Bible, you'll see this stuff and you think about it and you're like, yeah, I've been there. I've been in those shoes. I've been in that situation. I've tried copying the people around me just to see if I could pull up that respect. And it's very easy for us to understand what was going on. And what the people of Israel are really doing is they're taking these cultural frameworks of the stuff they see around them and trying to graft it on to who they are. They're trying to take things that aren't quite the same as who they are and say, well, we can just use it. We still do this 3,000 years later. When I was young and starting out in ministry, I read a lot of business stuff. Truckloads. The whole Jim Collins, Good to Great, Built to Last, all that stuff. And I was fascinated by it because there's a lot I felt I could learn. And there is really good wisdom in all those things. There's really wonderful, thoughtful, just consideration in a lot of that business stuff. But what I came to realize over the years is it's not quite the same as the church. There's wisdom to learn, there's things to understand, but it's not the same. And that's what the people of Israel come to understand as time goes by. So what happens is God says, okay, you want a king? Fine, you're going to have a king. I'll show you who I want Samuel to make as a king. And so God says to Samuel, I want you to take this gentleman who's tall, who's handsome, from the tribe of Benjamin, and his name is Saul. And I know when they say that, everybody's thinking, well, wait a minute, David? We're waiting for David in this. We're so used to hearing all the stories about David as the great king of Israel, the one who defeats Goliath, the one who has these horrible mistakes with Bathsheba. We're waiting for that guy. But you don't get to that guy unless you understand Saul. You see, God picks Saul for a reason. And he unites the 12 tribes. He leads the nation. He pushes back the Philistines. He gives the nation room to grow. But as what happens is he falls away. He starts to do things that he's not supposed to do. He starts to usurp the role of the priests, the prophets, and do some other stuff that leads him out of God's grace. And so that's when God says, okay, Saul, I've had enough. It's time to bring somebody else on board. Now, what's really interesting as we read through this story, as we look at the life of Saul, you get this fascinating question. This question that the rabbis have argued about literally for centuries, and to my knowledge still are arguing about. And they're arguing about it because it's such a great question. Did God know that Saul was always going to fall away and that he chose that? Or did God say, I'm going to give him the chance and then we'll see what happens? In some ways, it doesn't matter for us because what we need to understand is we're presented with the same choice that Saul is. God has a call on each and every one of us. God has a plan for each and every one of us. God wants us to follow his will. Whether you're in your 90s and you've been surrounded here by your kids and your great-grandkids and great-great-great-great-grandkids, or you're this cute little munchkin who we're going to baptize in a few minutes. God has a call and a plan for your life. And what we see with Saul is he steps away from that. And there's this haunting line where it says, the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, saying that he no longer was guided by God, no longer given that wisdom, that leadership. Now, what happens then is where the story picks up what Pee-wee just read for us. God says to Samuel, look, it's time for a new king. I'm going to show you who it is. Go down to Bethlehem, take some oil. We're going to show you who the next person's going to be. And so Samuel gets down to Jesse's house where he's supposed to go. And he says, okay, let me see your sons. And first son he sees is the oldest son, the wisest, good-looking, tall guy. And Samuel's like, there we go. This is it. And God's like, nope, not the one. And Samuel's like, okay, who's next? And so they show him the second oldest son. And again, it's like, no, not the one. And goes through 7 sons like this. And each one, God is like, nope, this is not who I'm looking for. And Samuel at this point, it says to Jesse, do you have any other sons hiding around? I mean, do you got any more? Because none of these guys are the one I'm looking for. And Jesse says, yeah, I got one more. The youngest, he's out tending the sheep. So they bring him in. And God says, this is the guy who we've been waiting for. This is the one we've been looking for. And so Samuel anoints David as king. And he goes on to be the great king of Israel, the one who slays Goliath, the one who writes all these beautiful psalms that we still sing today. Is he perfect? No. Most certainly not perfect. But he is called by God. Now, there's a piece of this I want to pull. Usually we just focus on David. We say, okay, Samuel shows up, anoints David, David's king, boom. I want to go back to those 7 brothers for a minute. Those guys that were there. That God said, no, not the king. Those 7 brothers don't really pop up in the biblical narrative anymore. There's a time or two you see their names out there, but they're not really in the story anymore. The story follows David and others, but not so much these 7 people. Does that mean that they're any less loved by God? Does that mean that they're any less important to God? Does that mean that they're any less made in the image of God? Does that mean that they have anything less to do? No. So often we get in this mode where we think, okay, I'm not that guy. I'm not that important person. I'm not that person who does those great things, that once in a generation talent. Therefore, I am worthless. I remember a number of years ago, I was talking to somebody about some preacher who was about my age. And I was commenting how by the time they were 40, they had built up this amazing ministry, done this huge thing, nationally known and everything else. And I said to myself, and I said to this person I was talking to, and what have I done with my life? And she says, okay, how many of those people are there? And I go, about 1 a generation. And she says, there you go. Lots of other people in this world. And it is important to remember that just because you're not David doesn't mean you don't have a place in the story. Doesn't mean that God doesn't have a plan for you. Doesn't mean that God doesn't have a ministry for you. And so often what we do is we wrap ourselves up saying, I am not them. I want to be them. I want to be in that role. I want to be in that slot. And we forget God has a call on our lives to do something else. There only needed to be one king of Israel at a time. There only needed to be one person leading the army. And when God says to these other people, I have a different plan for you, we can roll with that. We can say, my role is something else. My call is something else. David has this wonderful ministry. David does these wonderful things, and he has his ups and his downs. And it is out of those downs that he follows God, that he writes those things like Psalm 51, create in me a new heart and renew your spirit within me. It is in those dark nights that he comes to work through those things. And that's his beautiful way for us to follow. But remember, he called the whole nation of Israel to be a light unto the nations, to be a blessing to everyone, Jew and Gentile alike. And just as we are called here in this place to share the love of Christ with all the world in whatever fashion he might call you. Amen.